All right, this week is DEI, and this is a really thorny subject. And I'm leading the conversation today, and I am less structured than Sarah. So this will undoubtedly be a wandering or meandering through the topic of DEI because there's a lot of ground to cover. We're going to try not to be too political, hopefully not being political at all, but it's almost impossible these days, at least here in the US, to talk about DEI without treading into politics. And just to sort of level set, DEI refers to diversity, equity, and inclusion, which has been over the last few years a corporate initiative to bring more voices, bring more diverse voices into the fold, both from hiring point of view and including suppliers and creating corporate cultures that reflect more broadly society. DEI has been a big push in corporate culture. However, and this is important, in the US, DEI is experiencing a massive backlash, especially in politics. And so this might not be as applicable in other regions, say in Europe and the UK, but certainly here in the US, not only is there a backlash, but there's actual legislation that is enacting laws, eliminating and forcing DEI out of public institutions, and increasingly turning their sights on corporations and how they operate and trying to get corporations to not have DEI in their organizations. And we've also had a couple of big companies lately very publicly eliminated their DEI commitments. And I would be remiss in just sort of setting this up if I didn't point out that in the politics realm, President Joe Biden stepped out of the presidential race here in the US, and now Vice President Kamala Harris, who is now the Democratic candidate for president. The conservative media has really come after her and labeled her as a quote unquote DEI hire. Empirically, that is I don't care what side of the aisle you're on, that's just lazy reporting. And it's not even a good criticism of Vice President Harris. This is the world we find ourselves. This is the world businesses find themselves in, this backlash to DEI here in the US. And that's changing how we think about, again, how we hire and our diverse supplier programs and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So today, Sarah and I want to really talk about and open up DEI a little bit for discussion, and we'll see where this goes and where we get to in the end.
I think it'll be a random roller coaster, right? A lot of different things to cover.
This is why Sarah usually leads the conversation. So if you're confused or bored by the end, it's my fault.
In preparing for our discussion today, I did some research, and of course, Reddit came up in my search. I always like to go on and see what people are saying. And there was something that was posted that I think is relevant, what we were just talking about, that I wanted to read. And it says, Apple's Vice President of Diversity, a Black woman and 20-year Apple veteran named Denise Young Smith, gave a speech highlighting the fact that a room full of white guys with very different backgrounds, views, and experiences is still diverse. She wanted to emphasize the complexity and multiple ways of achieving diversity and how we think about diversity. They fired her for it. And that's the problem with DEI and other ESG-backed corporate social responsibility BS.
There's so much to take apart there. First of all, you should get hazard pay for looking up DEI on Reddit. I can't imagine what you found out there. But I mean, not only do people like Denise are getting fired, but the VPs of DEI or other diversity initiatives are starting to get let go as well, and DEI departments are getting disbanded. My wife's a professor, and at the university she's at, they completely not only did they disband it, but it's they enshrined it in law that you cannot have DEI. And I think that quote is really gets at this is that, and also the corresponding firing of Denise, is that sometimes the definition of diversity is too ambiguous, and oftentimes it just ends up as one particular diverse marker that gets more prominent than others, and this gets at the crux of it. And I mean, it's not a surprise that people are feeling maligned, or for people from certain groups are feeling maligned, because they look at something like that you might have diversity that's not visible,
Correct.
and people are losing opportunities, or perceiving, which is probably worse, perceiving that they're not getting opportunities, and it creates discord and it turns into backlash.
And I would say there's a whole movement that started around the fact that selecting someone based on their race is racist in itself.
And in California, this has been a decades-long fight to dismantle race in admissions. And over the last couple of years, not just in California, but they have successfully disbanded that.
The whole getting into college has just
Yeah.
become insane. Like, school was never my thing. I'm not a good test taker. My SAT score was, well, pretty atrocious. And I look at now how hard it is to get into the university program. And there's a lot of people that have become really frustrated and upset. And they're saying their children or the kids themselves are not getting into schools because they don't meet certain DEI. They can't check certain boxes, and they have a 4.5, and they're on the rugby team, and they have all these other things, right, that they should be able to qualify and get in. But because DEI has become a part of the process, they're not getting accepted. And there's a lot of really upset people that are actually leaving California or sending their kids out of state and paying crazy out of state tuitions because of it.
Right. I mean, and you can see very clearly that if you have a well-performing kid and they don't get into a California university in which you are a resident, it's not that hard to draw a straight line between that and the backlash. So you can start to see that why people are avoiding college or starting to question the validity of college. And so, we do need to get back to business, but I do think this is why we can't just take DEI initiatives on their face that, oh, they're good, they're the right thing to do, because in the US, this is not an understatement when I say they're absolutely getting clobbered.
Let's tie it into most of our listeners work in supply chain and procurement, right, in some capacity.
I said we weren't going to talk about politics, but it took us 30 minutes to set up the conversation.
So let's start with the whole movement towards working with diverse suppliers. I think that's a good place to start.
Okay, so we're going to go on a wild tangent here right off the bat. So most supplier diversity programs that I've observed over the years, really prior to 2020, just were in name only. They were just sitting there. You would have a handful of diverse suppliers and whatnot, but it didn't really become a thing. And then as we were all locked down during the pandemic and George Floyd was murdered, then all of a sudden, like, everything went bananas.
Like literally overnight.
Yeah. Literally overnight.
Happened, and then the next day it was like everything DEI, everything diverse.
Right. It spurred a whole host of changes in the way businesses operate and the primacy they put on DEI. And what you see, though, is that by the end of 2020, as we went into 2021 and 2022, these diversity programs, diverse supplier programs, sputtered, and they just went nowhere. And then with the rise in inflation and sort of the economic uncertainty at the end of 2022 and into 2023, Those those supplier diversity programs were just slowly marginalized and de-emphasized, and I don't think they have really recovered since then.
So I'll throw into the mix. I'm not sure how large companies, when I'm saying large, I'm saying a billion plus in revenue, can actually have a successful supplier diversity program without having a program in place to coach and mentor and support and work with diverse suppliers. And the reason I say that is, in my experience, a lot of the diverse suppliers are what I would call small or very small businesses. You've got a team of one, a team of two, a lot of times less than 10 people total.
Yep.
And for that type of organization to support a billion-dollar plus enterprise is just not realistic. There is just not going to happen. They don't have the infrastructure, they don't have the corporate processes and systems in place, let alone the payment terms
Yeah.
that come along working with a large entity. I was working when I was in marketing procurement, I was working on a couple very large deals, and the insurance policy that was required would have put our firm out of business, right?
Right.
It's immediate,
Exactly.
like non-starter. So my point is, I have not seen a lot of supplier diversity programs be successful, but the reason why I think that is because there wasn't infrastructure to help those small businesses actually support and service larger corporations. So it's the larger companies that say, we want to be, have 50% of our procurement done by diverse suppliers by 2025, or whatever these initiatives are that they'll publicly tout and announce and include in their marketing and PR. Yet it's not realistic that it's actually going to happen.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, like if you and I started a business and we went to a big enterprise, the first thing they'd hand us is a 30-page NDA. I mean, how much would that cost us to have that evaluated? And that's not even us bidding on work, much less getting work.
And the 90 or 120-day payment terms. I mean, as
Right.
a small diverse supplier, that's just not even realistic or possible.
Right, exactly. And I actually remember our former guest,
Yeah.
Susan Walsh, the classification guru. I remember her posting about being a small business and getting essentially screwed over in the payment terms, and because the big business wanted to, I don't know, I don't remember all the details, but yeah, it was.
And then I guess I also question, if I'm running an RFP or RFQ and I'm procurement and it's a decent size spend, and this is something mission critical to our business, am I actually going to factor in or care about somebody being a diverse supplier? Or am I going to pick what's going to be best for our stakeholders and best for our enterprise, and where I can get the best overall value? And I just haven't seen a lot of times where somebody's going to be, we're absolutely going to work with you because of this. I feel like that's not often factored when it's important mission critical things. And maybe there's some categories, things like office supplies, for example, which maybe are a little more transactional and not as mission critical. But for very, very core things, I just don't see diverse supplier programs being that successful. Do we think there's a future at all? I mean, we talked about in the past, but do you actually see them being successful in the next couple of years?
Well, I do think they can be successful, and I do think that. Well, I want to go back to your point about mission critical suppliers. I agree with you. I don't think you can have mission critical suppliers. I do think, though, that if you can set up a program like you use, I forget the word
Office
you use, but
office supplies or
no,
transactional?
no, to
Oh,
support the smaller suppliers, that, and you sort of have a group within procurement that can help translate and work through different governance model with them. That can actually make a big difference, and then you can start to get smaller suppliers, maybe not doing tier one supplier status, but perhaps doing things like, if you're going to hire data scientists or AI specialists or whatever, that just you wouldn't get access to for because if you use I don't know, pick on Accenture or TCS as your tier one IT supplier. Well, they'll do all your quote unquote AI, but maybe actually if you went looking, you might find a one person or a 5-person shop that is diverse and might be worth engaging with. And so you would be then getting better talent and using a diverse supplier. But that takes that, like, there has to be some apparatus within the procurement organization to take advantage of that.
Yeah, and that's a lot of resources if you're going to build a support team to help your small and diverse suppliers. A smaller organization isn't going to have the bandwidth to do that. There's two things to talk about here from hiring. One is procurement professionals in general, and do we think the profession is becoming more diverse or not? And then the second piece is procure tech firms who are out trying to find talent. How can they, or should they even incorporate DEI into their practices?
Yeah. This gets to the core of, should you? And I think every organization has to decide that. Now, I will say that in general, my view on procurement is we tend to be pretty diverse. And when I look around, when I go through my Rolodex of CPOs, at least a third, maybe half are women. So that right there is just a big step forward. Was when you look around CIOs or CFOs, it's not the same, and certainly not CEOs. So I do think I do think in general we have good, at least gender diversity. I don't know that there's a lot of queer visibility within procurement. It's not to say that it doesn't exist, and that we and I say this as a queer person, that there aren't people in procurement doing that. But in general, like I was thinking, there's this great Women in Procurement that Amanda Prochaska does, and whoever else, I can't remember, but I was always, every time I think about that, is I think could there be queer people in procurement? And the number of people I can't either they're not out, or
Well,
it's
I
just not a
think it's
thing.
that no one's taken initiative to form something where people feel safe coming out and having conversations and, organizing things.
And then there's a legitimate question of, do we need that? Like, maybe we don't need that. So I don't know, but to your point, like I definitely think racial diversity and certainly other elements of diversity, and then there's also accessibility and other diversity and this is this is where the critics come in, because what is diversity? And that gets to the Reddit article you read, or that post. What is diversity? Do we mean gender diversity, race diversity? There's unlimited, and then all of a sudden you get into this circle of complexity, and then is it one diversity marker or multiple? So this is where then it starts to get really complicated, and it kind of falls apart because it's not clear.
Yeah, and then that goes back to when organizations don't label DEI correctly, and then somebody has a bad experience, employees immediately associate DEI with BS or negativity, and then it just kind of comes full circle. So the identity piece, I think, as we talk about procure tech brands, should they have DEI programs, and if so, how should that be involved in the hiring? I think a really important thing is defining what DEI means for your organization. It could be something very broad and basic as, we're going to have an inclusive work environment.
I'm old enough in my career that I remember a time working when it was all white men, or old white guys, really, or old rich white guys. And I would walk into a lot of rooms, and there was not a lot of diversity in the makeup of the room. And I'm not critiquing it. It's just merely a factual statement. What it did is it created a certain culture, and one that was very hostile to women, one that was hostile to queer people, one that was hostile to race, and it was not a great working environment. And now, as I'm older, that's not the environment I want to work in. Now, I'm not saying that every organization has to fit what I want. I'm just saying that as somebody, as I think about where I want to work, I want to be with diverse voices and to be challenged, because that's important to me and it's helped me grow in my career. And I think that's there's much more awareness of this now, because back years ago that was the only way, that like rooms full of white men was the only way. It was the norm.
And I think you nailed it when you said diversity of ideas and opinions and viewpoints, right?
Right. I mean,
That could be a DEI mission statement for a procure tech firm, and that alone is not necessarily alienating certain groups of people, but showing that you want to encourage an open culture and an open mindset.
yeah, I mean, where I work is full of people, of engineers that went on and got their MBA. And so they think a certain way. And there's nothing wrong with it. Like they've had a lot of, in fact, all of them have a lot of success. However, that's not me. So, and I I came in through the back door. Somebody left the back door unlocked, and I just walked in, and I never left. But it can be challenging on one hand, but there's tons of opportunity on the other hand, because if you have all these vertical thinkers and you're a horizontal thinker, or an outside the box thinker, then all of a sudden you can create your own space. So that's on one hand, and on the other, the firm has become much, much more diverse over the years for the reasons I enumerated before. There is a generational change, and now actually there's a problem that investment banking and consulting are having, of being able to just get anybody into the consulting ranks, because the younger generation doesn't want to go into consulting. So now it's not even like, forget diversity. It's a matter of getting the numbers.
Filling seats.
Yeah, exactly. So, so that's the flip side struggle.
I either am a CEO or I'm working at a procure tech firm, typically, less than 200 employees. So I would describe that as a smaller kind of startup environment. How should these types of organizations be thinking about DEI as it comes to hiring practices?
You need people with the right experience. If you're going to build an AI tool, you need somebody that knows AI. If you're going to sell to procurement, you need people that understand and can talk about procurement and not confuse the 7-step sourcing process for a procurement operations. You need the right talent, and the right talent will win. What you have to do is avoid falling into the trap that says, "Oh, well, I know Joe, Bob, and Frank for the last 30 years," and if you're comfortable with them, then you're comfortable with them. But as you build out the team, what I have come to appreciate in my old age is you want people that will challenge you. And too often, and I write about this when it comes to risk management, we tend to want to just give positive messages. And this is true in employee feedback. This is true in supplier relationships. It's true in many realms of our lives, probably our married lives too, is that we want to always talk about what's positive, and everything's great, everything's great, everything's great, and then it's not, and then it's a catastrophe. I'm putting together an executive team to go run a startup or to build a startup. I want people that are going to challenge and really push the boundaries, because increasingly that's how you'll get the separation. Because we look at the procure tech landscape, there's so many companies doing with so much overlap, that you really want the A team there. And I think each founder has to decide, what does that A team look like and what does the composition. And I don't think you can follow a formula that says, okay, I need one queer person and one Latinx person and one whatever. You'll just knot yourself into a pretzel.
I have a rule of thumb for when I hire, and it's tell me what I need to hear, not what you think I want to hear.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of goes along the lines with what you said, is hiring people that are going to challenge and tell you a different perspective and not always agree with you. And that causes the business to be much more successful, so you don't get yourself in a situation where everyone's a yes person and then the company doesn't do well and then it becomes a complete disaster and you don't have the right team there to execute and the company doesn't make it.
Yeah, and also there's also an introvert extrovert thing, because as I've talked to many founders, and some are horribly shy introverts, and others are extroverts. And the extroverts can sell you anything, and the introverts, it's like, what is it you're exactly doing? And so if you don't get the right pairing, and if there's not one right answer on that, but if you don't get the right pairing, somebody that can be that voice, I actually think you're I think one of the great things, we talked about this in our influencer episode, is one of the great things you did at SourceDay was bring a voice, an extroverted voice, to what was, my sense was, a very introverted, I don't know this, but what it felt like from the outside, a very introverted group there. And so putting you in was a shot of adrenaline into the messaging. And so I do think, as you're building an executive team, and even as you're hiring, make sure you have the right balance of introverts versus extroverts.
And I think it's important, just because you're in a quote boring industry or have a boring product doesn't mean you need to hire boring people.
Yeah.
You can
But
have
nothing about supply chain is boring. As we've learned for the last 4 years, procurement and supply chain is the most interesting function you can do in an enterprise, bar none.
But you can, there are definitely traditional industries, and I think people get trapped in their hiring practices of thinking they need to hire a boring person or somebody that quote looks the part, versus somebody who's going to bring a little bit of creativity and innovation and do things a bit differently. So that's, for me, as a marketer, that's something that's really important, and that I try my best to interview and back interview and check 10 people behind to see if I'm getting somebody who's of that level or not.
Yeah. And increasingly, again, back to this information exchange, we can see people's personalities and ability to deliver from what they do, what they put out in the virtual world, because now we have very vibrant mediums for doing that, whether it's LinkedIn, whether it's YouTube, whether it's TikTok. And so you can start, or if you're a coder, we can see your contributions in the public realm in ways that 20 years ago, it was, I'll have to take your word for it based on what you've written on the resume. And I think the resume is largely going away, or not going away, but it's ineffective, because, I mean, look, if you want to hire me, I have so much content out in the public world.
Go stalk you on YouTube.
Right, exactly. And people do that. And the same with you, and I would argue with many others. So, and if you're not doing these things, you should all really look at how you are being perceived out there in the world, because others are watching. And I think that's, at least for those that are older, that's a huge mindset shift.
How do you know if you are getting into the right environment or working for the right boss that's going to be supportive of whatever it is that your belief or mindset or philosophy is? Because that's really hard. I feel like I've learned that when you're interviewing, it's also so important for the person, you, not the interview, but the other person, to be interviewing and checking out the company just as much as they're doing with you.
Where do you want to work and who do you want to work with? And what are the types of personalities? Slight sidebar, but when somebody I know leaves a procure tech startup, one of the first things I do is contact them and I ask them what happened, why they left. And all too often they're very happy to sort of unburden themselves.
Unload and tell the truth.
Exactly. And so that helps me. I mean, I factor that in as I keep track of who's on the rise and who's on the, on the company, on the procure tech companies. So that's one of my little tricks for keeping tabs on what's going on in the market. Because if you start to get wind of, let's call it less than stellar behavior, or an inability to make payroll, then you start to know that, okay, these folks are in trouble. And so there's no reason you can't do that from a cultural fit. And I know I'm not a cultural fit for a lot of companies for a lot of reasons. And that's okay. Like, the company does not have to bend to me. And in fact, most companies won't. So it's incumbent upon me to find, at least in my opinion, to find the environment that's right for me, that will be a good fit for my personality and whatnot. So I think, I don't know that we're training job seekers to do this, certainly, and we're not training them in college. So I think an area of mentorship is to really help folks do their due diligence to find the right cultural fit, because I've watched quite a number of people go into, especially procure tech companies. It's different when you go into the corporate world, because that's kind of generically the same, or you know what to expect. But in the procure tech startup world, it can be really, it can be challenging and difficult.
I mean, I've always worked at startups, so it's all I know. It's what I love. I'm a builder. I'm not a maintainer.
Yep.
And it's a roller coaster. Let me tell you, you're going to lose some sleep, and it's stressful and it's super rewarding. But I see friends in the space make decisions that I'm not sure that they really fully thought through and fully vetted the organizations they went to. And then they wind up in an environment where it's not a safe place for them to give feedback or go to HR and express concerns. And so again becomes this whole anti-DEI, where they have such a bad experience and they don't speak up, and then they leave the organization. So I just think it's really, really important to do your due diligence. Now, that being said, it's a tough job market right now. So sometimes you have to take what you can get. I mean, depending, but if you have the ability to be a little bit flexible, do your due diligence. I mean, it's really important.
Yeah. And by the way, we also know this, that this can happen with co-founders. If you're going to start a company together, you better be all in on your co-founder and know them. And there's been, within procure tech, some pretty spectacular failures, but also more broadly in tech. I mean, there's, again, the Silicon Valley HBO show was really good at bringing this. But you really, like, doing a startup together with either co-founders or whoever your investors are, those can be really dicey elements, and you want good working relationships. And a friend of mine is a sole founder, and he has two other board members, and one of the board members every week is just all over my friend. And every time I talk to him, he's just always reacting to this one board member. And so,
which can suck the life out of you, and then
oh
it's
my
like
God,
energy left to actually be creative and run your company.
Right, exactly. And yeah, so buyer beware. And like you said, yeah, oftentimes, like, maybe he doesn't have other funding options or other investors. Maybe there are not a lot of jobs out there and you have to take what you can get. But but also it's important to be aware of all these dynamics. I've seen this with the city of Oakland. I live in Oakland. So where DEI initiatives, or at least diverse supplier initiatives, can often be used as excuses for bad purchasing behavior. We'll just call it that. And I think it's important to sort of call that or bring that out for attention, because if you're going to specify so much diverse spend, that humans are fallible, and oftentimes there are plenty of bad actors out there that will do malicious acts to get paid. And I think it's worth also just saying that also creates more bad will around diverse supplier programs. So you do want to be attentive to all of this. And so maybe that the good way to wrap this up is to really say that DEI can be a very laudable goal, but also it's very fraught. It's very fraught here in the US. And I think we have to not just take it as at face value that this is quote unquote a best practice. I think if we're going to push for this, we have to really roll up our sleeves and be critical about it and advance this in a way that is meaningful and is inclusive and not accidentally marginalizing other groups. So hopefully that got at some level of balance. In the back of my mind, I keep thinking that I'm just saying a bunch of anti-DEI stuff, which is, if that came across, that was not my goal today.
No, and I think from my perspective, to close out, if this is something that's important to you, be really clear about your intention and how you define things. I think a lot of the confusion and backlash has come from things not being clearly defined or things being mislabeled. So just keep that in mind if you're at a firm that's prioritizing or thinking about this.
Yeah.
So with that, we are going to sign off. We will see you next Wednesday. We are looking to build our subscribership on YouTube. We got like 60 subscribers within 7 days, which was kind of cool. So we're going to keep plugging that. We'd like to get over 200 subscribers. So if you're not already subscribed to our YouTube channel, please do that. And we have a form in the show notes. So if you have thoughts around DEI, we would love to hear them, maybe potentially do a follow-up episode, and you can do that anonymously if you didn't feel comfortable sharing name or company, or any questions or feedback you have for us for future topics. And with that, we will see you next week.